you can see the blood supply going to them and all that. The adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys, hence the name suprarenal or adrenal, renal being the kidneys. So they are separate glands from the kidneys, but sitting on top of them. And, I don't know why this doesn't want to respond. Let's see here. Okay. If you cut open the adrenal glands, they're kind of a triangular shaped structure. They have a dense, irregular connective tissue capsule on the outside that protects them. Then they have two regions on the inside. The adrenal cortex is the outer region, just like the outer region of your brain is the cerebral cortex or the cerebellar cortex. You know, you have the outer layer. So the outer layer of an organ is often referred to as the cortex, and then the inner region is the medulla of an organ. You'll see those terms used in other structures such as the kidneys. They also have a cortex and medulla. Think medulla as in the middle. It's the core or middle of the organ. And there's different hormones that come from those two locations. For some reason this does not want to respond. Okay, so if you were, oops, let me go back to this one. So we're going to start with the adrenal cortex, this darker pink area just under the capsule. And the cortex, if you look at it under the microscope, you can see the capsule at the top, and you have different tissue zones as you go from superficial to deep in the organ, and then you get into the adrenal medulla way down here. This is where the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced. We'll talk about them in a minute. Epinephrine is commonly known as adrenaline. So this is down here in the adrenal medulla is where that comes from. But we're going to first look at the cortex. You don't have to know the names of these regions, but you do need to know the hormones that come from the adrenal cortex. But each of these regions secrete specific hormones. The outer region, the zona glomerulosa, I'll say it right in a minute, secretes mineralocorticoids, and then the middle region produces glucocorticoids, and then the inner region secretes androgens, which are male sex hormones or masculinizing hormones. So the mineralocorticoids and a corticoid, meaning a corticosteroid hormone, coming from the cortex. Cortico referring to the adrenal cortex. And so mineralocorticoids regulate mineral homeostasis or mineral levels. Glucocorticoids regulate glucose metabolism, and androgens, as I said, are masculinizing. And we'll come back to the adrenal medulla a little later. In these zones, these hormones that are produced, and this is just showing you the steps to getting to these hormones. All of these, and this is the different zones. So these are the three zones in the cortex. Again, you don't have to worry about the names, but they always start with cholesterol. Cholesterol, remember, is a sterol or steroid lipid. It is used to make other steroid lipids, and that's what these hormones are. They're all steroid lipid hormones. So cholesterol is used to make aldosterone, which is the most common mineralocorticoid, and there's some others, but this is the most common one. This one we're going to look at. Cholesterol is also used to make the glucocorticoids, such as cortisol and some others, and then it's used to make the androgens that come from the adrenal cortex, the male sex hormones. And so here you can see that if you look at these hormones like estrogen and testosterone and cortisol, cortisol is actually a glucocorticoid. You don't have to memorize the structure of them, but they all have that same or similar structure. The four hydrocarbon rings fused together with additional groups that make each one unique added to that. But all of them come from cholesterol. So that's what this is showing. You don't have to memorize the pathway. It's just showing that through various metabolic steps, each one involving enzymes along the way, you can get all these different hormones. This one's pretty much just focused on the sex hormones, but the other hormones are produced as well by cholesterol, or from cholesterol, I should say, by modifying cholesterol. And the first one we're going to look at is aldosterone. This is the major mineralocorticoid coming from the adrenal gland. It regulates the levels of sodium and potassium in your blood. It also regulates hydrogen ions as well in your bloodstream. It helps prevent acidosis of the blood. And it's primarily regulated by the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, which is also called the RAA pathway. So this is one that is not regulated by the anterior pituitary. Some of the hormones that come from the adrenal cortex are regulated by a hormone coming from the anterior pituitary. This is not one of them. It has a different regulation. So, first of all, if you have dehydration or sodium deficiency, which is not usually a problem in this country, but if you were to be on a super low sodium diet, it might be. If you were eating most people have the problem with too much sodium in their diet. But if you were really trying to cut back on sodium, you might actually get a sodium deficiency, or if you lived in another country where there wasn't much sodium in the diet. What happens is if you have too low a level of sodium, that lowers the osmotic pressure. Because remember, sodium is a solute in the blood, and you have to have certain levels of all these different solutes in your blood to maintain proper osmotic pressure. If the osmotic pressure is too low, you don't have enough fluid, enough water moving into your bloodstream from your tissues. In other words, water will stay in the fluid of your tissues, and it won't get absorbed into your bloodstream, and that lowers your blood volume. So too much sodium actually increases osmotic pressure, and that increases blood pressure. Too low sodium decreases osmotic pressure because less water moves into the blood. As a result, moving in by osmosis, you end up with low blood volume. Also, hemorrhaging or bleeding. Some kind of bleeding situation can reduce blood volume. And when blood volume goes down, so does blood pressure. The two are directly related, which makes sense when you think about if you have a pipe and you have so much volume of water moving through that pipe. The more water moving through the pipe is going to increase the pressure in that pipe, and less volume is going to decrease the pressure. Now, what happens is your kidneys, and we're going to be talking more about the kidneys later this semester, but your kidneys have cells, specialized cells, that monitor the blood pressure. As blood circulates through the kidneys, the kidneys actually monitor the blood pressure. And if the blood pressure is too low, again because of a reduced blood volume, again because of those various factors, the kidneys, these kidney cells, called juxtaglomerular cells, but you don't have to know that name yet, but these cells in the kidneys produce renin. And renin is an enzyme. It is released into the bloodstream, and its effect is to convert a sort of inactive hormone, angiotensinogen. This is a protein produced by the liver. It's one of the plasma proteins we're going to be talking about. The liver produces this protein, releases it to the bloodstream, but it's inactive until renin converts it or begins that conversion. So it gets converted to angiotensin 1, which is still inactive, not doing anything yet, until that angiotensin 1 circulates in the blood through the lungs. And the lungs contain an enzyme called ACE, which stands for angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. And that converts angiotensin 1 to the active form of the enzyme, angiotensin 2. So you have this conversion going on. Renin converting this to this, ACE converting this to this. So you have enzymes involved in this pathway. Angiotensin 2 has two effects. One is it stimulates general vasoconstriction of arterioles. Arterioles are tiny arteries. And this, when you constrict the artery, that's going to increase blood pressure throughout the body. So that helps increase blood pressure. Another effect is it stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone. And then what aldosterone does, and it affects the kidneys by increasing sodium reabsorption from the filtrate. The kidneys are filtering blood, and before that filtrate, what we call the filtrate, leaves the body, water is reabsorbed, sodium and other things are being reabsorbed. So what the kidneys are going to do is, in response to aldosterone, they're going to increase the sodium reabsorption, put it back into the bloodstream. So by bringing in sodium, you increase osmotic pressure, also increasing water reabsorption, which increases blood volume. So both of these are going to help increase blood volume. Now you're also going to have, in addition to that, an increased secretion of potassium and hydrogen ions into the urine. I don't want to spend too much time on that because we'll talk about kidney function later. But one of the things that happens is in the kidneys, sometimes substances are put back into the filtrate from the blood. In other words, potassium and hydrogen ions are moved from the blood into the filtrate. So you're going to excrete and eliminate those ions. Now this way you're reducing the level of potassium, and you're also getting rid of hydrogen ions, which can cause acidosis or a drop in pH of the blood, which you don't want to have. This helps maintain proper blood pH. So there's some additional effects here. Now notice that over here it says increased potassium in extracellular fluid or in the body also stimulates aldosterone production. So this is the second thing that can increase aldosterone production so that you can excrete that potassium. So too much potassium in the bloodstream can also set into motion that aldosterone production. But in terms of blood volume, it's, we're primarily looking here at the increase in sodium, increase in water reabsorption, increase in blood volume, also increases blood pressure, brings it back to normal. Now you may have heard of ACE inhibitors, and this is probably the most common type, or one of the most common types of medications that people with high blood pressure take. So when somebody has high blood pressure, what they'll do is, if they're taking an ACE inhibitor, they will suppress this angiotensin II production, or this conversion. If there's less angiotensin II, then you're not going to get these effects of bringing up blood pressure. And so for people with high blood pressure, that helps bring that blood pressure back down again. So that's what an ACE inhibitor medication does. It inhibits all this happening right here. Any questions? Now obviously though, you're going to have some side effects because it's not only affecting blood pressure, it's affecting some other things. But that's what it's doing. Any medication is going to have side effects, unfortunately. Any questions about that? Okay, so that's a pretty complex thing. I put what the terms refer to up there. I also have it in, I don't know why this doesn't want to do what I want it to do, but let's see here. I also have this written out for you. So it's written out, the steps. Now, aldosterone, we've talked about this already. So let's just move on. But again, here it mentions getting rid of those hydrogen ions helps prevent acidosis. Your blood pH should be around 7.4. If it drops too low, that can be dangerous. So this helps get rid of some excess hydrogen ions. Okay, any questions about the mineralocorticoids, which is aldosterone is the major one. There's some others as well. Any questions about those? Okay, that's the only one we're going to look at in that group. Glucocorticoids, as the name implies, it affects glucose metabolism, but it has other effects as well. It also stimulates, some of the things it does, it stimulates the conversion by the liver. Your liver has enzymes that can convert amino acids and lactic acid to glucose for energy. You may recall that lactic acid is produced when muscles perform anaerobic pathways, and when they use that lactic acid fermentation pathway, that lactic acid is released into the bloodstream. It's actually lactate, but we're not going to get into that. But it travels to the liver, and the liver then converts that lactate to glucose that can then be used for energy. So you get this increase in that conversion happening in the liver. But you also can convert amino acids to glucose for energy. When that happens, amino acids have an amino group, and that amino group, which is NH2, if you look at amino acids, NH2, when that's released from the amino acids during that conversion to glucose, that results in the production of ammonia, which is a waste product. So the ammonia, which eventually gets converted to urea, and that goes into your urine, that's where it comes from. When you metabolize amino acids for energy in this way, you're going to produce ammonia, which gets detoxified by your liver to urea because it's less toxic. urea then gets excreted into your urine, and so that's how you get rid of that. Now, some other processes that glucocorticoids stimulate the breakdown of protein in your tissues to get more amino acids that way. Lipid breakdown. So all of these basically are ways of getting energy to make ATP for increase in metabolic processes. There's also some stress effects, or anti-stress effects, I guess, dealing with stress. For example, anti-inflammatory activities. These glucocorticoids not only affect glucose and other nutrient metabolism, they also inhibit white blood cells and suppress inflammation. And because glucocorticoids are good at limiting or slowing down the inflammatory response that sometimes happens when you have an infection, they are used for treating inflammation, like hydrocortisone. You can buy that at the store, and if you have a bug bite that's itching, you can apply hydrocortisone, and it helps bring down the inflammation and helps reduce the itching of an insect bite. So hydrocortisone is actually a glucocorticoid, but it's used also as a medication. Glucocorticoids are also used to deal with tissue rejection, because that's a big problem for people who get organ transplants. The white blood cells might try to reject that foreign tissue in the body. If you have a kidney or a liver or lung or heart transplant, and your white blood cells are going to sense that as something foreign, they're going to mount an immune response and try to get rid of it. So to suppress that activity, to suppress tissue rejection, people who have transplanted tissues or organs are put on glucocorticoids. The side effect of that, however, is that you're more susceptible to infection and catching colds and flu and all that, because your immune system is not going to work as well, but it does prevent or tries to prevent tissue rejection. Cortisol is one example of a glucocorticoid. It's one of the more common ones, but there's other ones as well. And let's look at that. Now, this is a hormone that is controlled by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and this process is stimulated by some kind of stress on the system, and that stress could be, that stimulus is stress, and that stress could be either physical stress of some sort, it could be emotional stress, it could be stress from disease. If you have an infection, or you're dealing with some kind of trauma, or you're dealing with a surgery or anything like that, any kind of stress on the body, you're going to increase your glucocorticoid production, because it's helping you deal with stress by increasing the available glucose, increasing available nutrients for energy. You can then fight whatever it is you're having to deal with. You can deal with that stress. So it's a way of dealing with stress. And so whatever the reason is you're having stress, that controlled condition, that homeostasis, is going to be out of whack. So your neurosecretory cells in your hypothalamus, because your hypothalamus is monitoring a lot of stuff. It's monitoring, in a way, it's monitoring your stress levels, which there's a lot of information around in your brain about the stress that you're feeling, or just chemicals in your bloodstream that you're experiencing stress, like from inflammation and that kind of thing. So the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus are going to produce a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, which is CRH. So you have CRH from the hypothalamus traveling down through the hypophyseal portal vein system, just like we talked about in that quiz. This is a releasing hormone, so it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce this hormone. It's got a very long name, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So right there it's telling you adrenal cortex, and it's a tropic hormone like all the anterior pituitary ones are, but what it's specifically stimulating is the release of glucocorticoids, not the other ones. So it's stimulating glucocorticoid production from the adrenal cortex. Again, don't worry about the zona fasciculata, you don't have to worry about that. But the cortex releases glucocorticoids, such as cortisol. into the bloodstream, and they increase in glucocorticoid levels help in negative feedback. So when you get a rise in those hormones, when they rise to normal or above normal levels, then you're going to suppress CRH production, which suppresses ACTH production. So during stress, you're going to have higher levels of glucocorticoids responding to stress, but you don't want to have too high a level. If you have too high a level, that can create some physical problems. So let me see here. Well, I think I turned off my. There, okay. So Cushing's syndrome is a result of high levels of glucocorticoids, and this can be due to adrenal cortex, an adrenal cortex tumor. It might be a benign tumor, but it's causing some problems. Because you're increasing metabolism of protein, things like that, and fat, too much cortisol or other glucocorticoids can increase muscle breakdown, because you're breaking down protein in the muscle to get those amino acids for energy. There's also an effect on fat. You get a redistribution of body fat, resulting in what we call a moon face or rounded face, and buffalo hump on the back, and also abdominal fat, increase in abdominal fat. And in fact, even just low, levels of constant, if you're having a lot of stress in your life, or if you're not getting enough sleep, that can also cause stress. You can get elevated levels of these glucocorticoids. It causes weight gain, especially in the abdomen. You don't have to have Cushing's disease to have that happen. Yeah.
What do you mean by buffalo hump? Like kyphosis or like a fat distribution thing?
It's a fat distribution. It's not the hump like from the backbone. It's from you'll see a fat deposit on the back. That's what they call a buffalo hump. And it causes a flushed face. And it's thought, I think President Kennedy had Cushing's. He didn't have some of these symptoms. I don't think he had the buffalo hump or anything. He obviously was a very thin man. He was, I think, being treated for it, but at the time, I don't know how much treatment there really was for that. But he did have that. If you look at him, he had that kind of flushed face, which gave him a look of like he was suntanned. But in fact, he struggled with his health through his life, and I think it was Cushing's that or I'm not sure if it was definitely Cushing's, but it was thought to at least be Cushing's syndrome that he had. Now, other problems, hyperglycemia, because you're breaking down glucose, putting it in the bloodstream. If you're doing too much of that, you're going to get high blood sugar levels. Osteoporosis, high blood pressure, because some of the effects have an effect on blood pressure. Decreased resistance to stress, because over time, as we'll see, you get less stress resistance if you have too much of this hormone. And then other things like infections, because you're suppressing the immune system, and mood swings, things like that. So let's see, what am I looking at? Okay. Oh, I'm skipping one. Okay, so I think that was all I want to say about Cushing's syndrome, but it is an excess glucocorticoid, primarily cortisol, excess cortisol problem. Any questions about that one? Now, the other hormones that come from the adrenal glands, from the adrenal cortex, are androgens. And the primary one is dehydroepiandrosterone, or DHEA, and that is shown, if I can get to go, in this picture here. When you go from cholesterol to this molecule is produced by the adrenal cortex, and this can be converted to testosterone and estrogen. So one pathway for making testosterone and estrogen is this pathway here through this DHEA. This is what's produced by the adrenal cortex, and I've made some changes in the notes. I thought I had this saved on my jump drive, and for some reason it didn't save, but I'm going to start here at the bottom. In boys and girls, the adrenal androgens are produced at somewhat low levels, but they do have an effect in children that are sort of a pre-puberty, early puberty age. You start getting pre-puberty growth spurts, in like elementary school age children, and an increase in axillary and pubic hair, also sweat secretion that gives them body odor. That's another effect that these androgens can have. And so you might notice a 9-year-old child having, maybe developing some body odor, or a child a little bit older than that, of course, maybe in their middle school age, developing axillary and pubic hair. These effects, the early effects that you see in early puberty come from these adrenal androgens coming from the adrenal cortex. In men, once you enter puberty, once a boy enters puberty, testosterone takes over. So DHEA is converted to testosterone in the testes, and then that's where most of the male sex hormone is coming from, the testes at that point. The androgens are the DHEA is still being produced, but it's being converted to testosterone primarily. So it's really testosterone that has the later puberty effects as well as effects in men. And women, we don't have testes, we don't produce testosterone. All of the androgens that we produce come from DHEA, from the adrenal glands, and this promotes sexual desire. Also DHEA, as I mentioned, is converted to estrogen. If you go back to that picture there, DHEA is converted to estradiol, which is a type of estrogen. And in fact, an estrogen is produced by the ovaries. So DHEA in the ovaries, travels to the ovaries, gets converted to estrogen. Now, there's most estrogen production in women starting in puberty until menopause. Most estrogen is being produced by the ovaries. But once a woman goes into menopause, then the estrogens are primarily being made through the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex will make low amounts of estrogen, and that's from that DHEA in the adrenal cortex. So you're actually getting some estrogen from the adrenal cortex in women who are menopausal and postmenopausal. But that's a low level of estrogen. It's not enough to prevent osteoporosis and things like that. Now, some women do have excess DHEA production, and that can have masculinizing effects. It can cause an increase in facial hair and other effects like that. So so DHEA can have other effects when there's overproduction of it in women. Any questions about those hormones? Okay, so moving on, the adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla there in the middle, the light pink area there. That's where you get epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those hormones are stimulated, their release is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, that's the nervous system that stimulates the fight or flight response. So one of the effects of sympathetic nerve stimulation is that it stimulates the adrenal medulla directly, so you have nervous stimulation. The adrenal medulla produces mostly epinephrine and smaller amounts of norepinephrine, 20% norepinephrine, 80% epinephrine. Epinephrine is what we commonly call adrenaline, which is kind of the pharmaceutical name for epinephrine. And norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline. You may recall that norepinephrine, or NE, is also a neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system. So it has two roles. It works as a neurotransmitter to stimulate the fight or flight response, and it helps in the fight or flight response stimulated by the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands and sympathetic nervous system work together. The effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla is increase in respiration rate, increase in heart rate and cardiac output, getting more blood and oxygen to your cells, vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure, and this helps get blood back to the heart, so you're keeping that blood circulating, again, so you can fight or flee a situation that's creating stress. And also it increases glycogen breakdown and lipid breakdown, again, to provide nutrients for this response. And so if you're exercising, you're going to have these effects, but also if you're under duress, like if you're trying to fight off somebody's trying to kill you, or you're running from a bear or something like that, any kind of situation that's a stressful situation, but also at lower levels, if you're embarrassed or stressed because you have to give a speech or something like that, you can have lower levels of this effect as well. Now this is just a table that summarizes those hormones. You can look at that on your own if you want to kind of help put it all together. The stress response, I just want to briefly talk about. Obviously, the glucocorticoids as well as the sympathetic nervous system and autonomic nervous system deal with stress, because stress It can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be due to a lack of sleep, it can be due to, you know, being in a hospital situation or being ill. You know, a lot of things can create stress. Stress is what keeps us going, though. A certain amount of stress is healthy. If you didn't have stress in your life, you'd lay in bed all day and just veg out. You wouldn't have to do anything. But obviously there's stress. You have to get up in the morning and get ready to go to class or go to a job. That's stress. But that's healthy stress that keeps you functioning in society the way you're supposed to. So as long as that's going on, everything's good. Homeostasis. However, so eustress is helpful, good stress that you need for everyday existence. Distress, like when you're under distress, that is unhealthy stress. Something's, you know, it could be being in a bad marriage or being, you know, abused, you know, emotional type stress. It could be dealing with school and, you know, and too much stress from maybe dealing with school, not healthy stress, but distress from having too many classes and too many exams.